The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium for the third time that morning, and still not a single hand had gone up for the last parcel of land on the block. The 40 acres known around Caldwell, Kansas as the Hurst plot, which everyone in town had already written off as cursed, flooded, and thoroughly worthless, except for the woman standing directly in the middle of it. The year was 1882, and the Kansas frontier was a place where a person's fate could be decided in the space of a single heartbeat, sometimes by weather, sometimes by war, and sometimes by the fall of an auctioneer's hammer on a warm Tuesday morning in the first week of September. Rose Hurst was 26 years old, and she had not slept properly in 11 days. She stood in the dry grass at the center of her father's 40 acres with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set hard as creek flint, watching the cluster of men gathered around the makeshift auction platform that Sheriff Carver's deputy had assembled near the road. She was wearing her father's old work coat over a faded blue dress, and her dark hair was tied back with a strip of cotton cloth. Her boots, which had been resoled twice already this year, were planted in the dirt like she intended to grow roots there. Her father, Samuel Hurst, had died of pneumonia 6 weeks ago. He had left behind a mortgage note with the Caldwell Savings and Trust, a barn that needed a new roof, a mule named Delbert, and 40 acres of land that everybody in Sumner County seemed to agree was more trouble than it was worth. The south end of the property ran along Elm Creek, which had flooded 3 times in the last 2 years, and the soil near the water was silted and uneven. The north end was rocky and exposed, and the well had run dry the previous summer. The bank had called the note due within 30 days of her father's passing, and Rose had not been able to raise the amount, not even close. She had tried. She had written to her father's brother in Missouri, who had written back with condolences but no money. She had gone to the bank herself and spoken to President Aldous Mayfair, who had listened to her with his hands folded on his desk, and then explained in the gentlest possible terms that the bank had obligations too, and that he was sorry for her loss, and that the auction had already been scheduled. She had spoken to 2 neighboring ranchers who might have considered buying the land directly from her, but both of them had inspected the creek bottom acreage and declined. And now here she was, standing on the land itself, because she could not bring herself to stand anywhere else. She was not going to make a scene. She had promised herself that. She was going to watch this happen with her back straight and her eyes dry, and then she was going to figure out what came next, the same way she had always figured out what came next since her mother had died when Rose was 14, and her father had started needing her to run the household as well as help with the planting. The auctioneer, a thin man named Horace Gable, who usually sold livestock at the market in Wellington, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief and looked out at the small crowd with the expression of a man who wanted very much to be somewhere else. There were perhaps 15 men gathered in the road and along the fence line, but most of them were there out of curiosity rather than genuine interest. Caldwell was a cattle town, and the drovers and merchants and saloon keepers who made up its population had little use for 40 acres of questionable agricultural land when there were easier profits to be found along the Kishom Trail. 40 acres, Sumner County deed registered in the name of Samuel Elbert Hurst, deceased, Horace called out, shuffling his papers. We'll open the bidding at $100. Do I have 100? Silence. Not the polite, thoughtful silence of a crowd considering its options. The blank, indifferent silence of people who had already decided. Rose pressed her lips together and looked down at the toe of her left boot. 75, Horace said, lowering the starting price. Someone give me $75 for 40 acres of Kansas frontier. Good water access along the creek, potential for that creek floods every other spring, called out a man near the fence. Several others laughed. $60 then, Horace said with diminishing conviction. Still nothing. Rose heard the sound of a horse being reined in somewhere behind her and slightly to her left, but she did not turn around. She was focused on keeping her breathing even. $60, Horace repeated, looking genuinely pained now. "Gentlemen, we are talking about 40 acres of, I'll give you 60. The voice came from somewhere beyond the fence line, easy and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. Rose turned then because the entire crowd turned, and what she saw was a man on a bay horse just outside the fence, with his hat pushed back off his forehead and one hand resting on the saddle horn. He was perhaps 30 or 31, lean but broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that carried a few days' worth of dark stubble, and eyes the color of good creek water under a clear sky. He was dressed like a working man, no frills, no flash, just worn canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, a leather vest, and boots that had seen serious use. He had a coiled rope at his saddle and a rifle in the scabbard, and the horse under him was clearly well tended, which told Rose something about him before he'd said another word. $60, Horace confirmed, pointing at the man. Do I hear 65? Nobody moved. Sold, Horace said, and his relief was audible. For $60 to the gentleman on the bay horse. Sir, if you could come forward and give me your name for the record. The man swung down from the horse in a single easy motion and tied the reins to the fence post. He walked toward the auction platform with his hat in his hand, and as he passed through the edge of the gathered men, he nodded to a couple of them in a way that suggested he knew them at least by sight. He climbed the 2 steps to the platform and bent over Horace's ledger. Louis Ramsey, he said, and wrote the name himself. Rose watched him. She could feel something moving under her ribs, something complicated and not entirely appropriate given the circumstances, because this man had just bought the ground she was standing on, and she should have been angry or frightened, or at the very least coolly composed. Instead, she found herself noticing the way he held the pen, which was like a man who had used one before but preferred other tools, and the way his hat, now that he was holding it, showed a ring of sweat around the band from honest work done in the sun. She walked toward the platform. Louis Ramsey had just handed Horace a small leather purse and was receiving his receipt when Rose stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. He looked down at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. "Ma'am," he said, "you just bought my family's land." He looked at her steadily. "I did. I'd like to know what you intend to do with it." He came down the steps and stood on the same level as her, which meant she had to look up slightly, because he was a good head taller. Up close, his eyes were exactly the color she had thought they were from a distance, which was a clear, honest gray-green like shallow water over limestone. "I intend to run cattle on the north pasture and fix the drainage issue on the south end," he said. "The creek's flooding because the channel's been narrowed by silt buildup over the last several years. That's a fixable problem." Rose stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined this stranger saying to her, a drainage assessment had not made the list. "You've looked at this land before," she said. "Rode through it twice in the last 2 weeks. Then you know the well is dry. I know where to dig another one. There's a seep spring on the northeast corner your father never developed, probably didn't know it was there. Vegetation pattern gives it away if you know what to look for." Rose felt something shift in her chest, a mix of grief and frustration and something else she couldn't quite name. "That's my father's land you're talking about improving." "It's my land now, legally speaking," he said, and his tone was not unkind. "But I don't think that's what's really troubling you, is it?" She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she admitted. "What's troubling me is that I have nowhere to go." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the other men were drifting away now that the auction was done, and Horace Gable was folding up his papers and planning his journey back to Wellington. The morning sun had climbed enough to be properly warm, and the smell of dry grass and far-off prairie surrounded them both. "You've been living on this property?" Louis asked. "My whole life, 26 years. You have family elsewhere?" "No one who has room for me." She said it without self-pity, just as a simple fact which somehow made it worse. Louis turned his hat slowly in his hands, looking out at the property behind her, the old farmhouse with its sagging porch, the barn with the roof that needed work, the cottonwood trees along the creek line, whose leaves were just beginning to catch the first hints of autumn gold. "I need a cook and someone who knows the land," he said. "I've got cattle coming up from Texas in 6 weeks, around 40 head to start. I'll need to have the fence line checked and the north pasture prepared. I could use someone who knows every corner of this property." Rose looked at him with her eyes narrowed. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you a reason to stay," he said, and the simplicity of the statement landed somewhere in the center of her chest. "Separate quarters in the farmhouse, a fair wage, and full transparency about what I'm doing with the land. If after a year you decide you want to move on, I'll give you a good reference and 2 months' pay." She studied him for a long time, the way she might study weather coming in from the west, trying to determine what kind of storm it was. "Why?" she finally asked. "You don't know me." Louis looked at her directly. "I know you were standing on that land when everyone else had already walked away from it. That tells me something." Rose Hurst looked at Louis Ramsey, and Louis Ramsey looked at Rose Hurst, and the Kansas wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek and made a sound like something beginning. "Fair wage," she said. "What does that mean exactly?" $15 a month, room and board included." "20, she said. He almost smiled. 18. "Done," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it, and his grip was firm but careful, as though he was aware of his own strength and chose to hold it back. She told him she needed 1 hour to gather her things and close up the rooms of the house she would not be using. He said he would be at the barn seeing to his horse. And that was how it started, on a September morning in 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, under a sky so blue it looked painted, with a handshake over a piece of land that nobody wanted, and a woman who refused to leave it. The first 2 weeks were a kind of careful negotiation that neither of them put words to. Rose knew the farmhouse from every angle, which floorboard creaked at night, which window latch stuck in damp weather, how to keep the kitchen stove burning evenly by alternating the oak wood she kept in the box by the wall with the softer cottonwood that caught fast and burned bright. She cooked in the mornings and early evenings, and during the days she walked the fence lines with Louis Ramsey, pointing out the places where the posts had heaved in the frost and where the wire had been stretched by cattle pushing through in previous seasons. Louis listened to her with his full attention, which was not something she was accustomed to from men. He asked questions that showed he had been thinking between conversations, and he made decisions about the property with a practical directness that she respected even when she disagreed with him, which she told him directly. "You're planning to run the fence line straight across the south pasture," she said one afternoon, following the hand-drawn map he'd sketched out after their first circuit of the property. "But that's going to cut off the natural water flow from the upland toward the creek during a wet spring. The water will pool against the fence." Louis looked at the line he'd drawn, then at the topography of the actual land in front of them, and then back at the map. "You're right," he said simply. She blinked. In her experience, men of his type, decisive, self-reliant, confident in their assessments, did not say that phrase easily or quickly. "I would root it here instead," she said, drawing a curve in the air with her finger to indicate an angled path that would follow the natural drainage. "Show me on the map." She took the map from him, which required their hands to be close together for a moment, and she drew the new line with the pencil he kept in his vest pocket. He watched the pencil move with the same attentive focus he brought to everything. "That works," he said. They were rarely anything but professional with each other, at least on the surface, for that first stretch of weeks. But the farmhouse was not large, and 2 people sharing its kitchen and sitting room and the common hours of morning and evening inevitably developed a kind of domestic shorthand. She learned that he took his coffee without sugar and would drink it while it was still hot enough to be uncomfortable. He learned that she did her best thinking early in the morning and should not be interrupted before she had finished her first cup. She learned that he had been raised on a ranch in the Texas Hill Country, the son of a cattleman who had died when Louis was 19, and that he had spent the better part of a decade working other men's ranches, and saving his wages before coming north with enough money to start something of his own. He learned that her mother had died of fever when Rose was 14, that her father had been a gentle man and a poor farmer but a genuinely good person, and that she had loved him in the complicated way you love someone whose limitations you know completely. There were evenings when they sat on the porch after supper, when the heat had come off the land, and the stars were appearing one by one overhead, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with fence lines or drainage or cattle schedules. He told her about a summer he had spent working a drive up through Indian Territory, and she told him about the year she had taught herself to read surveying maps from a book she had found at the back of Caldwell's small lending library. He made her laugh once genuinely, unexpectedly, by describing the personality of a particularly stubborn mule he had worked with in Texas, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her. It had been a while since she had laughed like that. He looked at her when she laughed, and then looked away, and there was something careful about that deliberate looking away that she filed in the back of her mind without examining it too closely. The cattle arrived in mid-October, 38 head rather than 40 because 2 had been lost on the trail north, and their arrival transformed the rhythm of the property entirely. Louis had hired 2 cowboys for the initial weeks of settling the herd, brothers named Court and Del Ingram from Wellington, young men in their mid-20s who were polite to Rose and efficient with livestock, and who ate everything she put on the table with grateful speed, and then asked if there was more. Rose found that she was not just cooking and managing the house. She was keeping records for Louis, who trusted numbers but found the bookkeeping to be the part of ranching he liked least. She organized his purchase receipts and his expense notes into a ledger system that she had designed herself, based on the rough system her father had used but made considerably more functional. She wrote out his correspondence when he needed formal letters sent to cattle brokers in Wichita, to the county assessor's office, to the implement dealer in Wellington from whom he was purchasing additional fencing wire. "You write better than I do," Louis told her one evening, reading over a letter she had drafted to a broker in his voice and from his perspective. "I write differently than you do," she said. "It's still your letter. It sounds more like who I'd want to be than who I am." She looked up at him across the table. The lamplight was between them, and it made the angles of his face look different than they did in daylight, softer in some ways, more defined in others. "I don't think that's true," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Don't you?" "No," she said quietly. "I think it sounds exactly like who you are." He looked at the letter in his hands for a moment and then set it down. "Sign it and seal it," he said, and got up to tend the stove, and she watched his back for a second before she looked down at the paper again. October moved into November and the Kansas winds turned cold and serious. Rose brought in the last of the kitchen garden, which had been mostly neglected in the chaos of the auction and the transitions that followed, but which still yielded enough dried beans and preserved tomatoes and hard squash to supplement the winter stores significantly. Louis helped her carry the squash in from the garden one cold Saturday morning, and they worked side by side in the thin autumn sunshine, and he told her about a kitchen garden his mother had kept in Texas, and she told him about learning to preserve vegetables from a neighboring farm woman named Mrs. Eckhart, who had come from Germany, and made the best pickled beets Rose had ever tasted. The Ingram brothers went back to Wellington in November with their wages and good words about the quality of the operation, and it was just the 2 of them again on the property, with 38 head of cattle on the north pasture and a Kansas winter settling in around the farmhouse like a hand closing. In December, something shifted. It happened the way important things often happen, not all at once, but gradually, and then suddenly. They had been caught outside during an early ice storm, which had come down from the northwest without sufficient warning. They had been at the creek end of the south pasture checking on the new drainage ditch that Louis had been digging in stages over the previous weeks, when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of an hour, and the sleet began coming in sideways on a cutting wind. By the time they reached the barn, both of them were wet through their coats and shaking with cold, and there was no practical question of going back to the house immediately because the ice on the ground made every step treacherous. They stayed in the barn with the horses, and Louis built a small fire in the old stone pit that Rose's father had constructed in the corner for exactly this kind of situation. They sat close to it, their wet coats steaming, and Louis had brought in the saddle blankets from the horses' stalls to put around their shoulders while their outer layers dried. "Are you warming up?" he asked. "Yes," she said, though she was still shivering somewhat. Getting there." The horses moved quietly in their stalls, and the wind pushed against the barn walls, and the fire crackled between them, and Rose looked at the side of Louis Ramsey's face in the firelight, and thought about how strange and specific and unlikely it was that this man existed, and that he had done the one thing that had kept her world from completely disappearing. "Why did you bid on the land?" she asked. She had wondered this from the beginning but had never asked directly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I'd been looking for a place for about 3 months, looked at maybe 6 or 7 properties between here and the Oklahoma border. Most of them were priced fairly, and I could have made any of them work, but none of them felt like the right place." He paused. "I rode through your father's property on a Thursday, 2 weeks before the auction. I saw the creek, saw the soil, saw the potential in the northeast corner, and I could see that it had been worked by someone who cared about it, even if they hadn't always had the resources to do everything right. There's a difference between land that's been neglected and land that's been loved past its capacity. This was the second kind." Rose sat with that for a moment. "And the auction day, when you came up and bid, I'd already decided. But when you saw me standing there, that was after I'd decided," he said. "But when I saw you there, I understood something about the land that I hadn't entirely put words to before." He turned his head and looked at her. "A place is partly what's been put into it by the people who were there before. You've been putting yourself into this land for 26 years. That's not nothing." Rose realized she had stopped shivering at some point, though the temperature in the barn had not changed significantly. "That is either the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me," she said, "or you're a very good talker." The corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile she had come to know. "I'm not a good talker," he said. "Ask anyone. I'm asking you. Then you'll get a biased answer." She laughed softly, and the barn held the sound of it for a moment before the wind took it. They stayed by the fire until the ice storm passed, which was several hours, and they talked the whole time with a depth and ease that surprised them both. She told him things about herself that she had not said aloud in years, about the loneliness of the years after her mother died, about the way her father's illness had changed him, about what it felt like to stand on that land during the auction and know that she was about to lose the only solid thing she had left. He told her about nights on the trail when the sky was so vast and the human world so small that it felt less like fear and more like a kind of clarity, and about what he wanted his life to look like when he was 40, which involved exactly this kind of place, working land that he had improved himself, with cattle and a proper kitchen garden and maybe a few more acres if the opportunity arose. "And the rest of it?" Rose asked. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Most men your age, when they're talking about what they want their life to look like at 40, they include other things, family things." The fire popped. Louis looked at it. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Well," Rose said, and found that she didn't have anything to add to that, and they both sat in the firelight with the unspoken thing between them, which was large and warm, and neither of them was quite ready to put a name to it yet. Christmas came to the Hurst property, which people in Caldwell had begun calling the Ramsey place, though Rose noticed that Louis never corrected anyone who still called it by the old name. She made a small celebration of it, a roasted bird from the neighboring Eckhart farm, old Mrs. Eckhart's daughter-in-law, Hannah, who ran the farm now with her husband Paul, cornbread, preserved apple butter, and a dried fruit cake that had taken 3 days to prepare according to a recipe she had memorized from her mother. Louis had ridden into Caldwell 2 days before Christmas and come back with a small paper-wrapped package that he set on the kitchen table without comment. She opened it on Christmas morning. It was a writing journal, bound in dark leather, with her initials pressed into the cover. She held it and did not say anything for a moment. "I noticed you keep notes on scraps of paper," he said, from across the table, where he was holding his coffee in both hands. "Accounts of the land conditions and the planting observations and so forth. I thought you might want a proper place to keep them." "Louis," she said, "it's not much." "It's exactly right," she said, and looked up at him, and something in the way she was looking at him made him set down his coffee cup and look back at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something open and uncertain beneath the surface steadiness. "Rose," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it did when anyone else said it. And then the Eckhart wagon pulled up outside with Paul and Hannah, and their 2 children coming to share Christmas dinner, and the moment folded back into the ordinary activities of the day. But it stayed in Rose's chest like an ember she kept checking to make sure it was still there. In January, Caldwell itself provided a complication in the form of Aldous Mayfair, the bank president, who rode out to the property on the 4th of the new year, with a man beside him that Rose did not recognize, but who Louis seemed to know from his expression when he came out of the barn and saw them. "Ramsey," Mayfair said, climbing down from his carriage with the stiff movements of a man who would have preferred to send a deputy. "Good to find you here. I wanted to discuss the deed situation." "The deed situation is settled," Louis said, his voice even and his eyes on the second man, who had dismounted from a separate horse and stood slightly behind Mayfair. "Well, there's been a question raised," Mayfair said. "You see, this gentleman here, Warren Kell," Louis said, nodding to the second man with a flatness in his voice that told Rose everything she needed to know about the nature of their acquaintance. Warren Kell was perhaps 40, heavyset and prosperous-looking, with a coat that was too good for a working ranch visit and the kind of confidence that came not from competence but from the frequent exercise of money. He had small dark eyes and a smile that Rose recognized immediately as the kind that stayed on the surface. "Louis," he said, with the ease of a man addressing someone he considered beneath him. "Surprised to see you here. Didn't figure you for the farming type." "Ranching," Louis said. 40 acres is more of a homestead. It's enough for a start." Kell's eyes moved to Rose, and she did not like what was in them when they did. "And who's this?" "Rose Hurst," she said before Louis could answer for her. "I manage the household and property records." Kell looked at her for another beat longer than was comfortable and then looked back at Louis. "Here's the situation, Ramsey. I had an arrangement with Mayfair here about acquiring this property, prior to the auction. The auction was meant to be a formality." "Was it?" Louis said. "There was an understanding." "I don't know anything about any understanding," Mayfair said quickly, in the tone of a man who absolutely did know something about an understanding and was hoping everyone would forget it. "I simply thought Mr. Kell might want to discuss a potential sale with you, given that." "There's no sale," Louis said. Kell's smile went through a small recalibration. "I'll pay you double what you paid at auction." "No. $150 for 40 acres that you got for 60. That's a profit of, I know what it is," Louis said. "The answer is no." Kell looked at him for a long moment, and then his eyes moved back to Rose, and Rose looked back at him steadily because she was not going to look away first. "Mayfair," Kell said, "I thought you said this property would be available." "I thought it would be," Mayfair said miserably. "The auction was open to the public, Warren. I couldn't prevent other bidders from." "Come back to my office and we'll discuss it," Kell said, and got back on his horse. He looked at Louis one more time. "You'll reconsider." "I won't," Louis said, with a finality that was completely without heat, which somehow made it more definitive than anger would have. Kell rode away with Mayfair's carriage following behind him, and Rose and Louis stood in the cold yard watching them go. "Who is he?" she asked. "Man I worked for about 5 years ago in Texas. He owns cattle operations in 3 counties, and he's been buying up land around Caldwell for the past year. I didn't know he had his eye on this property. Is he going to be a problem?" Louis looked at the road where Kell's horse had disappeared around the bend. I don't intend to let him be. What does that mean, practically speaking? He looked at her. It means the deed is filed, the sale is legal, and no amount of his money changes those facts. But it also means I need to be developing this land visibly and substantially so that there's no question about active use and occupation. The spring planting, Rose said immediately. If we can get 20 acres under cultivation by May, and the new fence line completed, and the second cattle purchase you were considering for March. They were talking over each other slightly, both working through the same problem from different angles, and they both stopped at the same moment and looked at each other. You weren't planning to just cook and keep records, Louis said. I never planned to just cook and keep records, Rose said. Something opened in his face. No, he agreed. I know that. The winter deepened, and the work continued, and something was building between them that both of them could feel and neither of them had addressed directly. Partly because they were both people who moved carefully, and partly because the daily rhythm of working together had become so natural that neither of them wanted to disrupt it by being wrong about what the other one felt. It was Hannah Eckhart who finally said it out loud, which did not surprise Rose because Hannah was a forthright woman from Ohio who had married into frontier life and refused to develop the frontier habit of leaving important things unsaid. Rose had ridden over to the Eckhart farm on a Thursday in early February to return a borrowed canning pot, and she stayed for tea, which was the custom between them. Hannah poured the tea and sat across from Rose at her kitchen table and said, without preamble, "That man is in love with you." Rose set down her cup. "Pardon?" "Louis Ramsey," Hannah said, in the tone of a woman discussing something obvious. "He came by here last week to ask Paul about the soil conditions in our east field, and he spent half the conversation talking about you without appearing to notice he was doing it. He talked about me. He talked about the property and the plans for spring and what needed doing before the cattle arrived, and every other sentence had your name in it. Rose thinks this. Rose has been working on that. Rose pointed out that the north fence needs to come in 2 feet before the ground softens." Hannah looked at her with the steady patience of a woman who had raised 2 children and had no time for unnecessary confusion. "He's in love with you. Are you in love with him?" Rose looked out Hannah's kitchen window at the flat gray February sky. "I don't know," she said. "Yes, you do," Hannah said. Rose looked back at her. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I do." "Then what are you both doing about it?" "Nothing," Rose said. "Rose, I know," Rose said, "but it's complicated. He owns the land I'm living on. He employs me. If it went wrong, if it went right," Hannah said, which was not a question. Rose looked down at her hands, which she was pressing flat against the table. "If it went right," she said softly, "it would be something I've never had." Hannah reached across the table and patted her hand once firmly. "Then stop talking about it and do something about it," she said, and got up to refill the kettle. Rose rode home in the early February dusk with her mind working and her heart doing something complicated and hopeful and frightening all at once. She put the horse in the barn and came into the kitchen, and Louis was there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the ledger open, the way he sometimes spent his late afternoons when the outdoor work was done. He looked up when she came in, and the way his face changed when he saw her, something that relaxed and something that came to attention simultaneously, told her that Hannah Eckhart was absolutely right. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with her coat still on and the cold still on her skin, and then she said, "Louis." He put down his coffee. "Rose, I think we should talk about something." "All right," he said in the voice of a man who had been waiting. "I think," she said carefully, crossing the kitchen and sitting down across from him at the table, "that something has been happening here for several months that neither of us has said out loud." He looked at her with those clear gray-green eyes. "Yes," he said. "I don't want to assume." "You're not assuming," he said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say it. I'm not," he paused. "I'm not a man who talks easily about what he feels, but that doesn't mean I don't feel it." "What do you feel?" she asked, and her voice was steady but just barely. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that focused, direct attention that had always made her feel like the only thing in the room. I feel like this property, that felt like a practical investment when I bid on it, has become something I can't imagine without you in it, he said. And that's somewhere between the fence line inspections and the Christmas dinner, and the ice storm, and every morning when I come in and you're already up, and there's coffee on the stove. He stopped. I feel like what I want my life to look like at 40 has changed, because what I want it to look like is this. What we've built here, with you. Rose pressed her lips together hard for a moment, because she was not going to cry over something good. She had cried plenty over things that were not good, and she was determined to hold on to this one clearly. I came back from Hannah Eckhart's house tonight, she said, knowing that I was going to say something to you because she took a breath. I have been falling in love with you since the morning you stood on those auction steps and told me you knew where to dig a new well. He blinked. And then something happened to his face that she had never seen from him before, which was a kind of unguarded joy, simple and uncomplicated and completely genuine. The well, he said. The well, she confirmed. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and the warmth of it went straight to the center of her chest. Rose Hurst, he said, I would very much like to court you properly, if you'll allow it. She turned her hand under his so that their palms were together. I'll allow it, she said. Courting, in the practical context of two people who already lived on the same property and worked together every day, looked somewhat different than the conventional version. There were no formal calls, no hat-in-hand arrivals at a parlor door. Instead, courting looked like Louis saddling both horses on a Sunday morning without being asked, and taking her out across the prairie to see the section of limestone bluffs 2 miles east of the property that turned extraordinary colors in the winter light. It looked like Rose making a supper of things she knew. He liked best pot roast with the dried herbs from the kitchen garden, proper biscuits, the apple cake, and setting the table with the good dishes that had been her mother's. It looked like evenings on the porch where the conversation had always been easy, but now had a different quality, warmer and more openly tender, where his hand would find hers on the armrest between their chairs and stay there. He brought her wildflowers in March when the first ones appeared in the creek bottom, a small and slightly wind-battered handful of early prairie flowers that he placed on the kitchen windowsill in a jam jar before she woke up. She found them when she came down to make coffee, and stood looking at them for a long time with her hands wrapped around her empty cup. She told him that evening that it was the best gift she'd received since the leather journal. Better than the journal, he said. Different kind of best, she said. He smiled, not the almost smile, but the real one, which she was seeing more frequently now and which still had the capacity to stop her breath for a moment. I'll keep that in mind for the future, he said. Warren Kell came back in March, and this time he came without Mayfair and with a harder edge to him. He rode up to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon when Louis was out on the north pasture, and Rose was in the yard chopping wood, which she had been doing since she was 14 years old and did competently, and with no particular inconvenience. She saw Kell coming up the road and set the axe against the chopping block and crossed her arms and waited. He reined in and looked down at her from his horse with that surface smile that she had categorized as the kind worn by men who expected other people to accommodate them. Miss Hurst, he said, Mr. Kell. Ramsey around. He's on the property, she said. Can I help you with something? Kell looked around at the yard, at the new fence posts visible in the distance, at the rebuilt section of the barn roof, at the general evidence of active and productive occupation. She could see him calculating. My offer stands, he said. Double what he paid, and that's generous. This land isn't worth that much. Then why do you want it, she asked. He looked at her and the smile flickered. It's contiguous with acreage I own to the east. I'm consolidating. We're not selling, she said. You don't own it, Miss Hurst. No, she said calmly. But I know Louis Ramsey's position on the matter, and it hasn't changed. Maybe if the offer was bigger, Mr. Kell, she said, meeting his eyes directly. This land has been worked and loved and improved by people who cared about it. It's not a transaction to us. I don't think there's a number you could name that would change that, and I'd rather be honest with you now than waste any more of your time." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, she heard the sound of Louis's horse coming in from the north pasture, and Kel heard it too, and whatever he had been about to say got folded back down into that surface smile. "I'll talk to Ramsey," he said. "You'll get the same answer," Rose said. Louis rode into the yard, saw Kel, and dismounted with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything. "Warren," he said. "Louis." Kel's eyes moved between them. "Miss Hurst here's been explaining your position." "She knows my position accurately," Louis said. "Last offer, $200. Louis looked at him. "My answer is the same as it was in January. This property is not for sale. It's a working ranch, and it will continue to be one." Kel looked at the two of them standing in the yard together, at the set of Louis's shoulders and the directness of Rose's eyes, and something in his expression shifted from calculation to recognition. He gathered his reins. "You'd both be doing yourselves a kindness to think it over," he said. "We've thought it over," Louis said. Kel rode away, and neither of them spoke until he was around the bend in the road. "He won't come back," Louis said, watching the road. "How do you know?" "Because the last time Warren Kel made 3 offers on something and got 3 no's, he moved on to the next target. He doesn't like to be kept waiting. He'll find easier ground to take." Rose let out a slow breath. "Good. Were you chopping wood when he arrived?" "Yes." Louis looked at the chopping block and the stack of split wood and the axe leaning against it, and then at her, and there was something in his expression that was both admiring and tender. "Of course you were," he said. Spring came to the Kansas frontier with all the power and color that winter had withheld. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and then settled into a clean, strong current that proved the drainage work Louis had done over the winter had improved the flow exactly as he had predicted. The south pasture, properly channeled now, dried out early enough for Rose to get the first seeds into the ground by mid-April. Corn, squash, beans, potatoes, and a section of kitchen herbs in the bed she rebuilt against the south wall of the farmhouse. Louis purchased an additional 20 head of cattle in April, bringing the herd to 58, and he hired back Court Ingram alone this time. A solid young man of 24 who had decided ranching was his calling, and who had told the Wellington ranch he'd been working for the winter that he was going north to work the Ramsey operation full-time. Rose liked Court. He was honest and capable, and treated her with the kind of straightforward respect that came from seeing 2 people who clearly knew what they were doing and working alongside them without pretense. It was Court who, in May, on a warm Saturday afternoon when he had ridden into Caldwell for supplies, came back with the piece of news that changed the shape of the spring. "People are talking in town," he said, unsaddling his horse in the barn while Louis and Rose were inventorying the grain stores. "About this place." "What are they saying?" Louis asked. "Mostly good things," Court said, "about how much it's improved. There's a general opinion that Ramsey's done well with it. But there's also some talk from Kel's direction. He's been telling people the sale at auction was improperly conducted, saying Mayfair had an obligation to him that wasn't honored." Louis and Rose looked at each other. "Is he pursuing it legally?" Louis asked. "Don't know, but he's got people listening." Rose turned away from the grain stores and leaned against the barn wall, thinking. "The deed is recorded," she said. "The auction was public. Mayfair can't have had an actual legal obligation to Kel if he ran a public auction." "Unless there was a written agreement," Louis said. "Was there?" Rose asked. "Not that I know of. But if Kel can convince enough people in this county that he was wronged, it creates enough social pressure to make operating here unpleasant even if the legal position is solid. So we deal with it the same way we've been dealing with it," Rose said. "By being here and being visible and continuing to build something that everyone can see." Louis looked at her. "You're not worried." "I'm angry," she said, which was different. "But anger is useful when you put it somewhere. I intend to put it into the corn." Court looked between them and wisely said nothing. The spring planting grew. The cattle settled into the improved pasture with the contentment of animals in good conditions. The new well on the northeast corner, which Louis had located in October using the vegetation reading he had explained to Rose on the day of the auction, was dug in April with the help of Paul Eckhart and a well man from Wellington, and it came in sweet and strong at 32 feet, which was better than Louis had hoped. The farmhouse got a new porch railing because the old one had become genuinely hazardous, and the barn roof was finally fully repaired, and Rose's kitchen garden became something that Hannah Eckhart would ride over specifically to look at, which was as high a standard of evaluation as Rose was interested in. Kell's noise in Caldwell died down without becoming anything legal, exactly as Louis had predicted, because a man who actually had a valid grievance files a lawsuit, and a man who does not has conversations in saloons. After 2 months of conversations in saloons that didn't lead anywhere, Kell's attention moved elsewhere, and the Ramsey property, or the Hurst-Ramsey property, as Rose had taken to thinking of it privately, was left in peace. It was June, on a warm evening after supper when Court had ridden to Wellington for a weekend, and the property was quiet around them, that Louis asked her. They were on the porch in the last light, which at this time of year came gold and horizontal across the prairie and turned everything it touched into something just slightly better than ordinary. Rose had her journal open on her knee, writing her end-of-week notes on the garden conditions, and Louis was beside her with his coffee, watching the evening come in over the land. "Rose," he said. She said, not looking up, "Put the journal down for a minute." Something in his tone made her put it down. She looked at him. He had turned in his chair to face her more directly, and he was holding his coffee cup in both hands but had stopped drinking from it, and there was something in his expression that she had come to associate with the moments when he was going to say something that mattered. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said, "about the right way to say it, and I've decided that the right way is just directly, because I think you prefer directness and so do I." "Yes," she said. "We've been courting since February," he said, "and before that he paused. Whatever we were for the months before February, and I've known for a long time what I want. I just wanted to be sure you had enough time, and enough of the right kind of peace to know what you want too." The evening light lay gold across his face and hands. In the north pasture, one of the cattle made a distant, comfortable sound. "Louis," she said softly. "I want to marry you, Rose," he said. "I want to build this life with you properly, not as employer and employee or as people who happen to share a property, but as partners in every sense of the word. I want your name on this deed beside mine. I want—" He stopped and looked at her with an honesty that was almost painful in its completeness. "I want to be the person you come home to and the person you wake up next to, for as long as we both have. I want the garden and the cattle and the hard winters and the good springs, and I want all of it with you." Rose looked at this man who had stood at an auction on a Tuesday morning and bid on a piece of land that everyone else had already walked away from, who had offered the woman standing on it a reason to stay, who had listened and learned and been honest and worked beside her and brought her wildflowers in March and told her she was not assuming and reached across a table and covered her hand with his. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady and certain and warm. "Louis Ramsey, yes." He reached over and took her hand in the same way he had at the kitchen table in February, and then he leaned forward and kissed her for the first time, careful and sure and entirely right, and the June evening surrounded them with all of its warmth, and the prairie light turned the whole world gold around the edges. They were married in October, 14 months after the auction, in the Caldwell Methodist Church on a Saturday morning that was cool and bright and impossibly clear. Rose wore her mother's ring, which she had kept in a small box at the back of her dresser drawer for 12 years, and a dress she had made herself over the summer from fabric she had ordered through the Wellington dry goods store, ivory cotton with a small pattern of dark blue, because she had known the dress was coming even before Louis had said the words, the way you know certain things before they arrive. Hannah Eckhart arranged the flowers, dried prairie flowers, and the last of the autumn asters, which were Rose's favorites. Court Ingram stood up beside Louis, with the expression of a young man, doing his level best not to show how pleased he was. Paul Eckhart gave Rose his arm in the absence of family to do it for her, which she accepted with genuine gratitude. The Reverend was a young man named Clark who was newer to Caldwell than Louis, and who conducted the ceremony with a straightforward warmth that suited both of them. When he asked Louis if he took Rose as his wife, Louis looked at her with those clear gray-green eyes and said, "I do," in a voice that carried no hesitation whatsoever. When the Reverend asked Rose the same question, she held Louis's gaze and said, "I do," with equal certainty, and felt something inside her that had been braced against uncertainty for 12 years, maybe longer. Finally, fully, and without reservation, let go. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the Eckhart farmhouse, because Hannah had insisted on it, with a small gathering of people from Caldwell who had come to respect what Louis and Rose were building. The feed store owner and his wife, the schoolteacher who boarded with a family near the church, two of the cattle brokers from Wellington who had done business with Louis during the year. It was not a large celebration, but it was warm and genuine and full of good food and honest conversation, and Rose sat at the long table with Louis's hand on hers, and thought that she had never in her life felt more completely in the right place. They went home that evening to the farmhouse, their farmhouse, as it now fully and in every sense was, and the Kansas stars were brilliant overhead, and the cattle were quiet on the pasture, and the new well gave sweet water when Rose dipped the cup to offer Louis a drink from it, standing on the porch in the cold October dark. He drank from the cup she offered and handed it back and looked at her in the starlight and said, "14 months ago I rode past this property and saw something worth building." "And now?" she asked. He took the cup from her hand and set it on the porch railing and drew her in close with his hands warm at her waist. "Now I see everything I was building toward," he said. She put her hands on his chest and looked up at him, and the stars were overhead and the land was all around them, and the farmhouse behind them held its years and its love and its new possibility, and she kissed her husband in the October dark with the whole of her life spread out before her like good ground waiting to be worked. The first year of their marriage was the fullest year Rose had ever lived. The cattle operation grew steadily, with Louis expanding to 75 head by the following summer, and the property showed itself to be, under proper management, exactly as capable as Louis had assessed it the first time he rode through it. The south pasture's drainage held through a wet spring that flooded 3 other properties along Elm Creek. The northeast well performed flawlessly through summer heat that drove other wells in the area down to uncertain levels. The kitchen garden produced abundantly, and Rose had begun keeping careful records in her leather journal not just of planting dates and yields, but of soil observations and weather patterns and the notes Louis made about the cattle's condition across the seasons, because she was realizing that she was building something that would be useful not just to them, but to the land itself over time. She and Louis talked about everything. It was one of the things she had not expected, that marriage to this man would not change the fundamental ease of their conversation, but would deepen it, add weight and intimacy and humor to it. He told her things he had not told anyone, and she told him things she had never found words for before, and they disagreed sometimes, about everything from which section of fence to replace first to larger questions about what the property should become in 5 years, and their disagreements were always honest and usually productive and occasionally very loud, followed by the particular satisfaction of 2 people who have aired something fully and arrived at something better for it. She was happy. It was a simple word for something that was not simple at all. She was happy in the mornings when the light came in through the east windows, and the stove needed banking and Louis was still asleep, and the house was hers for a quiet hour before the day began. She was happy in the work, in the physical satisfying labor of growing things, and managing a household and keeping accounts and solving problems. She was happy in the evenings on the porch, which had become such a fixture of their life together that she could not imagine the end of the day without it. And she was happy in ways that were private and warm and Louis's entirely, and those were the most important kinds of all. In the second spring of their marriage, Rose discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Louis on a Sunday morning in April, sitting across from him at the kitchen table over the remains of breakfast, in the direct way that she did everything. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He looked at her, and the expression that crossed his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, shock and joy and something almost like fear, all moving through together in the space of a heartbeat. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Rose," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you? I'm well, and glad. Are you glad?" He looked at her with that openness she loved in him, the way he never performed an emotion he didn't have. He stopped. His jaw tightened for a moment in the way it did when he was feeling something large. "Yes," he said, "I am so glad." She squeezed his hands. "Good," she said, "because I intend to keep planting the kitchen garden." He let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath. "Of course you do. And keeping the accounts. I wouldn't ask you to stop." "And walking the fence lines. Rose, what?" "Come here," he said, and she came around the table and he drew her into his arms with a gentleness that was still, a year and a half into their marriage, capable of catching her off guard. She rested her cheek against his shoulder and felt his hand move slow and careful through her hair. "We're building something real," he said quietly. "We already built something real," she said. "Now we're adding to it." The summer moved with a fullness and heat that Rose carried through steadily. Hannah Eckhart was a consistent presence and invaluable source of practical guidance about what to expect, and Louis proved to be the kind of man who paid attention in exactly the ways that mattered, who noticed when she was tired before she said so, who took over tasks without making a production of it, who made sure she ate properly when the early months made her appetite uncertain. He was not hovering or anxious, which she would have found suffocating. He was attentive and steady, which she found, quite simply, like being loved. Court Ingram, who had been with them through all of it now, had developed a deep loyalty to the operation and to the Ramseys both. He was 25 by now, a serious and capable young man who had grown into his responsibilities with an ease that impressed Louis, and who had recently begun riding out to see a young woman in Caldwell named Alice Marsh, whose father ran the feed store. Rose liked Alice enormously and was quietly pleased about the direction of things, because Court deserved something good, and Alice was exactly the kind of direct, capable woman who would suit him. In December of 1884, their son was born. They named him Samuel for Rose's father, and he arrived on a cold night with Hannah Eckhart present and Louis pacing the length of the sitting room with the controlled anxiety of a man who was very good at managing everything, except the things that were entirely outside his control. When he was finally allowed into the room and Rose put Samuel into his arms for the first time, Louis stood completely still for a long moment looking down at the small face, and then looked up at Rose with an expression she would hold in her memory for the rest of her life. "He looks like you," Louis said. "He looks like a newborn," Rose said practically, but she was smiling. "He looks like you," Louis insisted, with a certainty that made her laugh softly. Samuel grew. He was a good-natured, curious infant who became a determined, active toddler, and he filled the farmhouse with a particular brand of noise and joy that Rose had not known was missing until it was there. He liked the cattle, which he called cows, with a conviction that neither of his parents corrected, and he would sit on the fence rail with Louis's hands secure around him, and watch the herd move across the pasture with enormous concentration. He liked the garden, in the destructive way of small children who find the act of pulling things from the ground deeply satisfying. He liked Court, who had an apparently inexhaustible patience for small boys, and would let Samuel sit on his horse's back with a frequency that Louis thought was perhaps excessive, and Rose thought was entirely fine. Court married Alice Marsh in the spring of 1886, in the same Caldwell church where Louis and Rose had married, and Louis and Rose stood up for them with the particular warmth of people who understood exactly what kind of life was beginning. Alice moved to the property to live in a small adjacent house that Louis and Court had built together over the previous fall from timber hauled from Wellington. And the Ramsey property, which had once been the land nobody wanted, was now home to two families and a growing operation that people in Caldwell discussed with a respect that had been built from nothing and earned over years. In the winter of 1886, they received news from the county assessor's office that Warren Kell's cattle operations to the east had been sold following a debt judgment against him in a Wichita court. Rose read the notice aloud to Louis at the kitchen table and then set it down. "I don't feel satisfied," she said, considering the feeling. "I thought I might." "No," Louis asked. "No, he didn't lose because of anything we did. We were just here. We stayed." Louis looked at her. "That's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "Staying is not nothing." He reached across and took her hand, and outside Samuel was making a racket in the yard with the tin cup he had been carrying everywhere since he'd found it in the kitchen, and the Kansas morning was gray and cold, and entirely familiar and entirely home. The year 1887 brought a daughter. They named her Clara, after Louis's mother, and she was a different creature from Samuel, entirely quieter, more watchful, with a precision about everything she did that appeared so early it could not have been learned. Where Samuel threw himself at the world, Clara observed it first. Louis said she got that from Rose, and Rose said Louis was the most observant person she knew, and they had a gentle argument about it that resolved in the way most of their gentle arguments resolved, with both of them conceding that the other was probably right. The property by 1888 carried 110 head of cattle, a kitchen garden that had expanded to include a small orchard of apple and plum trees planted along the east fence line in Louis's first spring there, 2 full-time employees besides Court, and a reputation in Sumner County as a well-managed and consistently productive ranch. The farmhouse had been extended, a room added to the west side for the children, and a proper study built off the kitchen for Rose's records and correspondence, because the kitchen table had become insufficient years ago. Louis had taken to consulting Rose formally on major decisions about the operation, which he had been doing informally for years, but which the formal acknowledgement of made a difference that neither of them had to explain to the other. He brought the ledgers to her study and they went through them together, and she made recommendations, and he made decisions, and sometimes his decisions differed from her recommendations, and sometimes they were identical, and both outcomes were the product of people who trusted each other enough to disagree honestly. She had learned things from him too. She had learned to read cattle the way he did, to assess the health and condition of an animal from a distance, to understand the quality of grass by the way a herd moved through it. She had learned the practical engineering of fence and water management that he had brought from his Texas years. She had learned that a hard problem was often best addressed by sleeping on it and coming back to it in the morning, which was his instinctive approach, and which she had at first found frustratingly patient and then gradually found wise. He had learned from her how to tend something living, not cattle but growing things, the garden and the orchard, and the management of the household with its shifting seasonal rhythms. He had learned that good records kept meticulously were worth more over time than he had initially appreciated. He had learned that Rose Hurst had strong opinions about almost everything and was correct about most of them, and that the cases where she was not correct were best discovered through respectful argument rather than silent compliance. In the evenings they still sat on the porch when the weather allowed, the two of them and sometimes the children, and Samuel would run in the yard until he was called in, and Clara would sit with elaborate seriousness on the step and look at the prairie with those watchful eyes and occasionally announce something she had observed. "The creek is lower today than yesterday," Clara said one evening, aged 3, in the tone of a person reporting findings. Louis looked at Rose. Rose looked at Louis. "How do you know?" Louis asked his daughter. "The sound is different," she said. Louis reached over and took Rose's hand on the armrest between their chairs, the way he had been doing for years, and Rose turned her palm up to meet his, the way she had been doing for years, and they looked at their serious, perceptive daughter on the step and at the sunset moving across the Kansas prairie and at the land that had been nobody's and was now entirely and wholly theirs. "She gets that from you," Louis said. "She gets that from you," Rose said. They were both right and they both knew it. The following spring, 1889, brought an opportunity that neither of them had anticipated. The property adjacent to theirs on the north, the 60 acres that had belonged to a family named Whitmore who had never entirely made it work and had finally decided to return east, came up for private sale. Louis heard about it through the cattle broker network before it was widely known, and he came home and told Rose about it over supper. 60 acres, she said. What's the north end like? Good high ground, no flooding risk. The soil's been rested for 2 seasons. What are they asking? $200, it's fair. Rose was quiet for a moment, doing the mental accounting that she always did automatically. We can do it, she said, if we defer the wagon purchase until fall. That's what I thought, he said. The wagon can wait. The north acreage can't, she agreed. You want to do it, he asked, though she could hear in his voice that he had already decided yes. Yes, she said, but I want my name on this deed too. He looked at her across the table with that direct, open look. It's been on the original deed for 5 years, Rose. I want it on this one too, she said, from the beginning. It will be, he said simply. It's your land as much as mine. More, she said. He acknowledged this with a small inclination of his head that was the closest thing to a formal bow she had ever seen from him. More, he agreed. The 60 acres were purchased in April of 1889, which brought the Ramsey property to 100 acres total, and the deed was filed with both of their names, Louis James Ramsey and Rose Elaine Ramsey née Hurst, because Rose had wanted her father's name somewhere in the record even after she had taken her husband's. The summer of 1889 was the best summer the property had ever seen. The cattle were healthy and productive. The orchard produced its first real crop of apples, not a large one, but genuine and sweet, and Rose made cider and preserved apple butter and fresh pies for 3 consecutive weekends, while Samuel ate apple wedges directly off the tree, and Clara collected the fallen ones into her apron with her usual methodical precision. The new north acreage was seeded and showed excellent potential, and Court and Alice welcomed a baby daughter of their own in July, whom they named Rosie at Alice's insistence, which made the real Rose simultaneously touched and faintly embarrassed, and Louis quietly delighted. They had built something from nothing. Or more accurately, they had built something from a piece of land that everyone had agreed was nothing, which was not the same thing, because nothing is formless and this land had always had form and potential, and a stubborn, water-patient capacity for growth. It had needed someone to see it right, and Louis Ramsey had seen it right, and Rose Hurst had known it right for 26 years before that, and together they had made something of it that was solid and true and would outlast both of them. On an evening in late summer, with the air just beginning to carry the first faint hints of the season turning, Rose sat on the porch after supper with her journal open and Louis beside her and both children put to bed inside, and she looked out at the land in the last light and thought about the morning of the auction, 7 years ago. She had been standing in dry grass in her father's coat, watching a group of men decide what would happen to her world, and she had been alone, and she had been frightened, though she would not have admitted it to anyone who asked. And then there had been a voice easy and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard, and a man on a bay horse with his hat pushed back and one hand on the saddle horn, and everything had changed. Not all at once. Carefully, honestly, through work and conversation and trust built in small increments over time, until it was so large and so solid that she could no longer see around it, did not want to see around it, would not have traded it for anything she could imagine. Louis, she said, he said, the way she often responded to him when she was occupied with something. I want to tell you something. He closed the paper he had been reading and gave her his full attention, the way he always did. "When you bid on this land," she said, "I was angry, I was frightened. I didn't know what I was exactly, I just knew I wasn't going to leave." "I know," he said, "but I want you to know that when I think about that morning now, what I feel is grateful." She looked at him steadily. "Not for the land. I was going to fight for this land with or without you somehow. I'm grateful that it was you." Louis looked at her for a long moment. The evening light was on him, the same gold and horizontal light that she had always loved about the Kansas evenings, and it lay across his face and his hands and the gray that had begun to appear at his temples in the last 2 years, which she thought suited him entirely. "Rose," he said. "What?" "There is nothing in my life," he said quietly, "that I am more certain of than the fact that coming up that road and bidding on this land was the best thing I ever did. And none of it would be what it is without you in the center of it." She closed her journal and set it on the small table between their chairs, and she took his hand and held it with both of hers, and they sat in the last of the summer light with the Kansas prairie spreading out all around them, 100 acres of it that was theirs and tended and true, with their children sleeping inside and their cattle on the north pasture, and an orchard along the east fence that was only going to get better with years. "We should plant more apple trees," she said. "We should," he agreed. "In the spring, along the south fence line where the light is best. You've thought about this." "I think about everything." "I know," he said, and there was a warmth in it that was 7 years deep. "That's one of the things I love about you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did not often do, being a person who stood upright as a general preference, but which she did sometimes in the evenings when the world had been good. "Tell me the others," she said. And he did, quietly and specifically and at some length, sitting on the porch of a house that had been saved by one bid at an auction, and built by two people who had understood each other from the beginning even when they were still working out the words for it, while the Kansas stars came out one by one overhead, and the prairie settled into its immense and patient dark. Samuel Ramsey would grow up to be a rancher, like his father, with his mother's directness and his father's capacity for quiet observation. He would run the north acreage himself one day, with all the confidence of someone who has never known a life where the land was not theirs. Clara Ramsey would grow up to be a naturalist of a kind the frontier did not have a word for yet, keeping meticulous records of the plant and animal life of the creek bottom and the prairie that surrounded the property, notebooks full of observations that began in a child's hand and developed into something serious and precise and genuinely scientific, filling the shelves of the study where her mother had kept accounts and her father had signed letters. A third child came in the spring of 1891, a boy they named James, for Louis's father, who was different again from both his brother and sister, easy-tempered and quick to laugh, and possessed of a charm that appeared in infancy and showed no signs of diminishing, and who grew up understanding that his home was a place built by love and work in equal measure, which is the best kind of understanding a child can have. Court Ingram stayed. He and Alice built their small house into a larger one as their family grew, and he became not just a hand on the Ramsey operation, but a genuine partner in it, the kind of arrangement that was uncommon and valuable, and that Louis had always hoped for, and Rose had helped make possible by being honest with Court from the beginning about what the operation was and what it was trying to become. The Ramsey land became, over the years, one of the better-regarded operations in Sumner County, not the largest, but the most consistently productive and the most carefully managed. People who knew it said it was the kind of place that had been built by people who understood what they were building, which was true, though the whole of the story. The auction, the woman standing in the field, the man who had bid and asked her to stay, was known only in pieces by most, and in its entirety by the two people who had lived it and by the children who had grown up hearing. It told across the supper table on winter evenings when the stories of how things began seemed most worth telling. On a morning in September of 1892, 10 years from the day of the auction, Rose Hurst Ramsey walked out to the south fence line alone, early, before Louis was awake, before the children needed anything, before the day had properly begun. She walked through the kitchen garden in the early light, through the orchard where the apple trees were heavy with fruit, and the plum trees had come in strong this year for the first time, and out to the fence line where the creek ran clean and clear in its improved channel, and the new well marker stood solid on the northeast corner, and the cattle moved slow and settled on the north pasture. She stood at the south fence and looked at the land. It was, if anything, more beautiful than she had thought possible, given where it had started. The south pasture ran green and even to the creek. The house behind her had a new coat of white paint that Louis and Court had put on over the summer, and which showed bright against the September blue of the sky. The barn stood solid and whole. The orchard gave its color to the east. Everything she could see from where she was standing had been thought about and worked on and cared for, by her hands and Louis's hands and Court's capable hands, and the hands of the men they employed, and before all of them by her father's hands, which had done the best they could with what they had. She heard footsteps behind her and was not surprised. Louis came to stand beside her at the fence line, coffee in hand, his hair slightly uncombed from sleep, wearing his work clothes already because he was a man who woke ready to work. He handed her the second cup which he had brought for her, and they stood side by side at the south fence and looked at the land together. "You're up early," he said. 10 years today," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, 10 years. From the auction. He looked out at the land, at the creek and the pasture and the orchard and the distant line of the north fence. She could see him taking it in the way he always took in things of importance thoroughly, with his full attention. "When I rode past this property in the fall of 1882, he said, I saw potential. I saw what it could be." "And now?" she asked. He turned and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything that they had built together. The years of work and honesty and disagreement and laughter and grief and joy, and the particular intimacy of two people who have chosen each other again every morning for a decade. "Now I see that I was completely wrong about what I was looking at," he said. "I thought I was looking at land with potential. I was looking at my whole life, and I didn't know it yet." Rose looked at her husband in the September morning light, and the creek ran behind the fence, and the cattle moved on the far pasture, and somewhere in the house one of the children was beginning to stir, and the world was full and solid and hers, and she put her hand on his arm and leaned close to him, and he put his arm around her shoulders and held her in the way he had always held her, warmly and carefully, and with the kind of permanence that is not about possession but about choice. Made and remade freely, over and over and over again. "I knew," she said softly, "I knew what I was looking at. I just didn't know you were coming." He pressed his lips to her hair. "And now," she looked out at the land, their land, the land that nobody had wanted and that had become the truest thing she knew. "Now I can't remember what it was like before you were here," she said, "and I have no interest in trying." The Kansas morning opened around them, bright and full of the particular golden light of a September that knows what it is, the last generosity of summer before the serious season comes, the world giving its best before the long patience of winter. And on 100 acres of frontier land that had been written off and redeemed and built and loved, Louis and Rose Ramsey stood at the south fence with their coffee and their 10 years and their 3 children asleep in the house behind them, and they watched the light move across the prairie the way it always had, patient and gold and entirely uninterested in what the world thought was possible. They had made something here, something real and lasting and true. And they knew, both of them, clearly and without reservation, that they were only still at the beginning of it.